Hi, welcome back. So between the parts I've just made the whites of my eye a little bigger, which I've just done in Photoshop by using the Control T, the transform tool, and they used to be this big for the white of the eye, and all I've done is scaled that up a little bit just to give myself a little bit of extra leeway when I come to do the texture for the eyes. So that's the only change I've made. And I've just popped open Mari. So if you go to the Projects tab, you may have some already open projects. I've got none on this machine, so I'm going to create one. Before we start doing anything in Mari, we're going to actually need to create a project folder. So just go up to File, New. So we'll just call ours Bert. And if we look under here, you've got geometry. Now this will be the geometry that we're going to paint. So in our case, this will be our Bert for Mari object. So I'm going to put that in there. The mesh options for this remain at default. We're going to be using a UV. We don't need selection sets, so we'll just create those in Mari's default way, and we don't have multiple geometry, so this is not relevant. The important thing for us here is what sort of maps we're going to create. So we're going to want a color map, and these will act like a bit like Photoshop channels, so you can always add them later. So to start with, I'm just going to do one 4K color map in the 8-bit color depth. So I'm going to select OK to that, and Mari will now open our project with our dinosaur here in a 3D view. So you start off on the orthographic view, and the controls are very similar to Maya. So it's Alt and left mouse to sort of pan around. It's hold middle mouse to move, and it's hold right mouse button to zoom in and out. Just Windows update there, sorry about that. So really it takes a bit of a getting used to navigation in Mari. It's fairly similar to Maya, but it works in a slightly different way how the character actually moves around. You'll also probably be seeing a grid on yours. I think I turned mine off some time ago. So if you go up to View, you've got all the different layouts here for Mari, and if we go under Display Properties, you'll see here that I've got my grid turned off. So that's what you're probably seeing. Now I prefer to work in this instance with the grid off, so I'm just going to tick that to invisible. Okay, and before we get started with actually painting this, I just want to go through some basic principles of Mari. So brushes, basically, you have the same as you have in Photoshop. So I can just start painting on this guy here. Color picker is fairly similar to the way Photoshop works. We can just pick colors and start painting away. If you want to change your brush, you can do it through the brush editor. So they have some presets for kind of different brushes, organic, sponges and things. So if I come round here, you'll notice that this paint now moves along with the character. By default, this is not the default behavior. So if I clear the paint buffer, which is this paint we've got stuck here, by pressing Control Shift and C, and I'll put this back to the default behavior, which is auto bake and clear. And this is projection in Mari. Mari is a projection painter. So basically when we paint something on here, this time with an organic brush, when it's on auto bake and clear, as soon as we move the camera, you'll notice I got a little delay there. That bakes that down into the actual mesh. So I can come in, paint a bit, and as soon as I move, that will bake the color onto the actual mesh, or in our case, onto the UV map. So if I wanted to paint a bit of a pink stomach area here, I just bake that down by pushing B, and we're good to go. Now that's the default behavior. I don't like it for one simple reason. It takes away some flexibility. If I was going to come in here and paint this eye, so I got my eye painted like this, and then I want to kind of take a look at this from a different angle, or maybe I've decided that I want to move it slightly. Well, at the moment, if I move the view, that's just going to be baked straight on there. So if I undo that and set the behavior under projection to clear only, now I can draw away in here. It's not a problem, so we just draw there. And if I decide I want to move this, I can just kind of move the camera around, and you'll see that the paint goes with it. So once I've got that into a position that I like, I press B to bake it, and that then bakes it down. So having this not automatically bake all the time allows a degree of flexibility. So for instance, now I could move this down, get it into a more appropriate position, hit B to bake, and there we go. Now, brushes in Mari work a very similar way to brushes in Photoshop, so you can change the opacity, the radius of the brush, the size of the brush. You can change the rotation on the brush. For instance, normal Mari brushes, press R and then left mouse button, drag forward and back to change the size of the brush. If you press W, you can rotate the brush around to get it into a different position, and you can continuously do that to build up, brush patterns within your workflow. So you've also got opacity, which hold O, and you will be able to scale the opacity back so we get much less. There we go. You can also change all this up here, similar to Photoshop. So if you want to go back to an opacity of 1, you can just click it up there. Then you've got things like flow rate, again a bit similar to the airbrush in Photoshop really. Nothing you really shouldn't have come across. And once you've done with your painting, just B to bake it down. So projection in Mari is extremely important. If we look at the projection behavior itself, it's on clear only now. This is the bake behavior, so that means we have to, every time we paint, we'll need to manually push B, because if we don't, the paint will simply move and end up maybe not what we want it. So once you paint, press B to bake that down. Now, on the projection behavior at the moment, let me change color here so we can see what's what, and I'll change to this blue color. At the moment, and I'll change it to brushes. Now, you can do it under the brush editor, or you can just hold K, which will bring up this quick panel, a bit like the hotbox in Maya. So I'll just select a hard brush, and I'll change the radius of that a bit. And if I draw, let's say, blue on here, just around the eyes, there we go, and push B to bake. That's baked on, and as you can see, it's only on the side I painted it. But sometimes you're going to want that to go through. So if we look at the projection behavior, we can change that to through, and this time, let's do this with a different color once again. Let's take a green, and this time when I paint this green here, okay, bake it out with B. When I flick round, you'll see it's gone right through the mesh. So just a couple of basic concepts really in the projection. You can either go on the front of something, which will just paint on the front of it, or you can go through it, which will go all the way through it. Okay, so it's a really simple precept. You either paint on the front or paint through, but it takes a bit of getting used to, because you'll find sometimes you're in here painting away at the front of the character and then you'll spin it around and you've accidentally painted the back as well. So it's definitely something to be aware of. The other thing is that you want this behavior set to clear only. Now you can leave it on manual, which would be basically, in order to bake this out, I'm going to press B, but even though I've baked it out, you'll see it's still there. So if I press B again, I'll bake it there, B again, there, and this can be a useful behavior for certain things. And then when you want to clear the thing you've painted, you press Control Shift and C to clear the paint buffer. Now generally speaking, when I'm painting away, I want the projection on front and the bake and clear to clear only, but again it comes down to choice. Right, another concept in Mari that you're going to have to be aware of is masking. You will be doing a lot of masking in Mari. If I can show you this, if I come out here and let's say I want to paint the flat objects on the front of the dinosaur, but I don't want to catch any of the side at glancing below, because right now what happens if I do this and bake that out is you'll get this, you see I've missed a bit there, it's got a big hole in it, and what I really wanted to do was just paint the front, not the side as well. So to clear the paint buffer, and I'm going to just reset this guy to default, which I can do by going into the UV view, selecting a patch. There's the UVs, you can see what we've painted on them now. Now if I want to select a whole patch, I can hold P and S to select, and select all three patches, and then I can go to patches, let's see, fill, and let's fill those all with a grey colour. So just clear that paint buffer that was still there, B to bake that colour out, go back to the orthographic view, and you can see that I've filled that all with a grey colour. Also in Mari we can go ortho and UV, so orthographic and UV, and let's say I just wanted to paint the skin. Because if you're coming up here to do some manual painting around, let's say the eye, it's quite difficult to get just the outside without getting the inside too. So a much easier way, if we could isolate just the skin area of this character, which we can do by holding S, selecting just the patch we made for the skin, and then coming up here and going visibility, hide unselected, and that will just show me the skin. So now if I wanted to come in and paint around the eye, it's a much easier proposition. Then I don't get anything on the eyeball. If I bake that out now and bring everything back, so show all, you can see that I've got a perfect edge painted in, and I haven't managed to get any of that on the eyeball at all. So in Mari you can use these patches as a really quick selection method. We can show and hide different bits of geometry. You know, if I wanted to just show the horns, I have them all in this patch, so S, select them, and then we can go in and hide unselected, and that will just show me the horns, basically the toenails and the fingernails, and this is going to make that a lot easier to paint without sloshing extra color on the body. And you know, we have this guy in here, which is the inside of the mouth, and I'll show you later on how to hide individual UV shells, but for right now we'll just stick with patches. So let's go and show everything. Okay, and if you want to get the selection off because you don't like the green highlighting, which drives me nuts, so just a really OCD thing in my case, but you know, I don't really like this highlight, just press S to select a patch and then select no patch, and you'll be back to everything. Okay, so really now this will make our job a lot easier. When we're painting the skin, we'll be able to paint the skin. When we're painting the horn and bone, we'll be able to show this patch, and when we're painting the eyes, we can just show this patch, which also has the gums on it. Alright, but before we get started with painting anything, we really need to look at, first off, just a quick buzz through of edge masking. Now we've got this back to all one color, I'll be able to show you a bit better. So if I just want to paint, say, the front of this or the side, but I don't want the paint to splosh over into any angular details. So if I wanted to come and say paint this without the paint being able to splosh over on this right angled surface, I'd use an edge mask. So I'm going to come up and I'm going to go to edge mask here, which is under projection, and I'm going to flick on the edge mask, and you'll see that certain parts of this mesh go red. So if I turn that up to maximum, let's turn this up too. So this is just the start of the mask fall off and the end of the mask fall off. If you're not seeing the mask, you have to make sure your mask preview is enabled. Now, regardless of whether the preview is enabled, the mask will still work, but just while we're testing this out, we'll put this in. So you can see here, the red is where I'm not going to be able to paint. So right now, before, when I tried to paint out this front part, I got paint all over here. Let's see what happens now. So I'm coming in, I'm painting away. Basically, I'm just painting the front, and I'm going to hit B to bake that out. I'm going to turn the preview off, and you can see that that masks the edges here of our character. So edge masking in Mari is very important, especially when you're painting a file texture, so something like a skin or an eyeball. You really don't want that to become stretched out as Mari tries to wrap it round the edge of the character. So we'll look at that in further detail, and you do have other masks. You have channel masks, depth masks, and basically what you would expect to find, but the main concepts here are basically the bake behavior, the projection, and the masking. All of these we're going to use together to create our texture. But for right now, before we can even start any of that, we need to get a shader on this guy, because at the moment he's got the kind of the default shader on. So if you go under shaders here, we're going to add a new one, and I'm just going to add a blin, same as kind of Maya blin, and you'll see that lightens up considerably. And then I've got all the channels here to plug bump maps, normal maps, environment, colors, ambient occlusion, and whatnot in. And here I can change the specular highlights on the character, just to give me a better idea of what it's going to look like when I get it into Maya. Now I can change the amount of ambient occlusion on the character, but you'll see that will do absolutely nothing, because we haven't generated any ambient occlusion for this mesh. So before we go any further, I'm just going to dot back into the UV view. I'm going to select all these patches and fill them once again. So just patches, fill grey. just so I don't have any of that. Then I'm going to press S, select outside the patches to unselect them all. Go back to the ortho view. In fact, I need to bake that grey fill. Go back to the ortho view. And let's generate some ambient occlusion. So if you come up to Objects, Ambient Occlusion, Mari will generate the ambient occlusion for us. And this can take a minute or two. And there we go, that generated the ambient occlusion. So now if I use the ambient occlusion slider, I can get more or less ambient occlusion. Now the nice thing about Mari, if you look down at its masks, there is an actual ambient occlusion mask, so we'll be able to mask out this occlusion and paint around it, which means we'll actually be able to paint the ambient occlusion directly on top of the model. If I enable this mask now, so let's turn off the edge mask. Now we just have the ambient occlusion mask. So anywhere that I draw at the moment is going to be lighter. So if I take a white color or a very light grey, and I can actually do this directly on the UV view, it's probably easier. So you can see on the UV view what's occluded here, and this is kind of the tongue, I think, which is inside the mouth, so you would expect it to be very occluded. If I just take a big paintbrush now and come across this like so, we have the mask on, so it won't let me paint into the occlusion. I'm going to hit B to bake that out. And if we go to our orthographic view and turn this off, you'll see that when I flat shade this little guy up here, we've got lighting. In fact, we'll leave him the same. We'll just turn the ambient occlusion off. So you'll see there that I've got some occlusion actually physically painted onto the model. If we look at the UV, you can see I've managed to physically paint a ambient occlusion on here. Now, of course, we could make that, whoops, that's perspective view, ortho. We could make that far more dramatic, you know, depending on the masking. And I could obviously put some ambient occlusion back on the shader, turn on the ambient occlusion mask, make sure that's on, then I can turn on the mask preview, and I can just flick this around. So let's invert this. So this is now only going to let me paint the darker spaces, but I can kind of tone this down a bit. I can start to tweak where the ambient occlusion is going to go. So I find this more easy to do when it's not inverted. So let's have a look here. Okay, that will give us more occlusion, and you can tell by the mask that we're getting more occlusion here. Okay, and if we look at the head, it's probably an easy place to look at, but as you can see, I can get more or less occlusion. So let's have more, and let's come in here and mask the areas of occlusion quite nicely. Now I can invert. So let's get a kind of very dark grey color here. And once again, we can paint on the UV. So let's just take this dark color and paint that out. Because I've got an inverted map, first I painted it a bit lighter, which of course would be the areas of no occlusion. Now I'm working with just the areas of occlusion. So I'm going to bake this in. I am going to turn off the occlusion mask. You can see here on the UV that we've obviously got some much darker occlusion now. I'm going to turn off the mask preview, and I'm going to go back to the ortho view. I am going to turn off the ambient occlusion altogether within Mari, and that's what we've actually painted. So Mari makes it very easy to just quickly, you know, get some shadowing on your model within your texture. I mean, this is already looking a lot better, and if I flat shade it up here, you can see what it looks like with no lighting effects within Mari. So you can definitely see that all this occlusion around here and here is being generated by our texture and what we've painted, not by some trick of 3D lighting. This is completely flat shaded. So let's bung on the lighting on the full mesh, and we get something that looks like this. So within Mari, masks are very important, whether they be edge masking, ambient occlusion masking, and projection also quite important. Now, again, in a traditional painting workflow, brushes, obviously which ones you pick. If you press K, you can get to the quick selection, or you've got the brush editor here. You can also tweak the shader. You don't have to use a blend. You can use, there's quite a few in Mari, but for our intents and purposes, a blend will be just fine. Now, the other thing you'll find yourself doing in Mari quite a lot is painting through an image. So if I go to my image manager, and I'm just going to open the images we saved from Photoshop, so our skin and also our eyeball, which I've got here. So I'm going to eye and skin. I'll just select them both with Shift and open, and you'll see they come over here to the image manager. Now if I want to use one of these in Mari, I'm going to use the paint through tool, which is here just under the eraser, and then I'm going to take the thing that I want to paint with, I'm going to drag it and drop it out there on the viewport. Now there's a couple of ways I can do this. If you look here, you've got the tool help. So if we want to say scale the image, it's Control Shift and drag it along like so. Now I can do this in this view. I can get this lined up with the eye and make sure the pupil is in the right place. Let's have a look. So around about there. The difficulty is, at the moment, if I was to paint, I'm going to end up painting, all over the place. It's not such a great thing. I mean, I get the eye in there as well, but I also get all this white stuff around here where it's not supposed to go. So clear the paint buffer. Now, as we did before, we can go and hide everything but what we're painting on. So in this case, we're going to be painting on this patch. So let's just S for select the patch, and back into the orthographic view, and then just go visibility, hide unselected, and that just gives me the eye to work with. That's going to be a lot easier. So now I can Control Shift and scale this up to the size of the eyeball and just kind of paint that in. So I can probably use a bigger brush. There we go, much easier. And that's painted in the eyeball. So let's B to bake that out. And I'm going to press P to go back to the paint tool so it gets rid of the image there. And you can see here I've got the problem where I didn't get that quite central. So the pupil is not quite in the middle, but let's just visibility, show all, and there you go. I've got the eye kind of in place, but as you could see, for sort of really precise placement, that was a bit tricky. And as we've got the eye laid out flat, I can cheat. I can basically paint it directly on the UV. So once again, pull in your image, make sure you're on the paint through tool. Let's scale this up now in the UV view, which is a bit easier for us to do. Oops, scale that image to the right size, and let's see, there we go. Okay, just want to make sure that I get this right the first time. There we go, and now I can paint through, and it's much easier for me to get that in the center of the eyeball in the UV view. I mean, you can do it in the 3D view, it's perfectly acceptable, but sometimes it's easier to paint on the actual UV. So let's take a look at the ortho view. P to go to the paint tool, and now I've got that eye painted in there, lovely jubbly. Pupil is in the middle. Now I need to come in and paint this black, which I could do again by going here using a paintbrush, and let's make sure we're on the paintbrush tool. And you'll notice I can't paint on it. It's because I have this UV patch selected. So let's clear the paint buffer. Let's nip into the UV, and let's just unselect anything. So S, click here, and now I should be able to go down and just paint this in a bit black. There we go, or at least I would if I was painting in black. And now I can come in and paint this inside of the eye here black as well. So really just want to come in here and make sure we're painting black. I think on our file texture, our texture wasn't quite black at the outside here. So you can, in Mari, just come in and paint here. Just make sure the back is black and just really paint that pupil out. Now, as I happen to know that we have a nice flat UV for that, and if we look over here, this is the inside of the eye. So if I just paint this black and B to bake and go back to the ortho, you'll see the whole thing's been painted black. So sometimes, you know, especially when you're tweaking, so if I wanted to come up and paint some shadows on the inner eye, this is a lot easier on the actual mesh, and sometimes it's easier to simply paint the UV map. It completely depends on what you're going to try and do. The problem with painting a UV map is For our UV, there is a seam between this arm and this body. So if we paint the UV, we're going to get a texture seam. If we paint just in Mari, as I will now demonstrate, so I've just painted across that arm and body there, and there's a texture seam there, we know there is. So if we look at the UV, let's have a look at this. There's the black we painted on the arm, and there's the black we painted on the body. Now that's completely seamless. Mari has calculated where it needs to jump the seams, which obviously if we'd have painted a pattern on here, the pattern would not match. However, if we paint the pattern in the 3D view, the pattern's going to match. So it depends completely on what you're going to do. So during the course of the next, probably an hour it will take us to paint this thing. During the course of the next hour or so, we're going to look at different techniques in Mari to do different things. We'll look at some masking, some gradient blends, some different paint brushes and stuff like this to get a cool looking cartoon dinosaur. So I hope that's got you somewhat familiar with Mari. Have a play with it, and I'll be back in the next part when we'll start really painting this thing, so we'll get some skin textures in and stuff. So I hope you found this useful, and I'll see you in the next part. Thanks for watching.